Hi there from Chicago. This is Big Ten Today, presented by Gatorade. Mike Call and Anthony Herron. Our buddy Ross Dellinger going to be back with us next week. Do we have a slate of games this weekend or what? I
think we have the slate of games.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember when the schedule came out, I marked down, okay, let's see. You'll have Penn State, Ohio State, which turns out to be number 4 versus number 3.
True.
You have the number 1 team in the country taking on the defending national champions.
Yes.
Add in Wisconsin, Iowa, USC, Washington. That's not even all the games.
Yeah, man. We got some
slate.
good ones between rivalry, between the stakes on the line, the gravity of these games in the Big Ten Conference this weekend. Yes, very excited about it.
Let's break down the action right now by starting off with our big story, and it is that top game of Penn State and Ohio State. Here you look at the season stats right now. This will be the 8th straight meeting between these two when they both are ranked. The only Buckeye loss, remember, was by 1 point on the road to the current number 1 team in the country when they were driving in the last minute of the game. OSU has dominated this rivalry recent history, winning 7 straight matchups and 9 of the last 10, all against James Franklin. Plenty of angles to break down in this game, but let's start with the most important position, the quarterback play. Drew Aller has been the guy at Penn State, but he got injured in last week's game. How big a deal is it if Bo Prabula is taking most of the snaps this weekend?
Well, the good thing is James Franklin takes an approach where his number 2 quarterback constantly gets work, constantly is prepared for moments just like this. In Drew Aller's freshman season, he was that guy. You think all the way back to Will Levis when he was a backup in State College a few years ago. He was still working into the game, still a part of the Penn State offense. And we've seen for multiple seasons now with Drew Aller as the starter, Bo Prabula getting major work in the Nittany Lions offense. So as far as just understanding the Andy Kotelnicki system and recognizing what he needs to do, how he's capable of feeding the football around with variety that Kotelnicki will throw at the Ohio State defense, Bo Prabula is as ready as any backup quarterback could be for this moment. And also just the way he carries himself, his demeanor. He has really ingratiated himself with his team, with his coaches, because of the way that he constantly prepares like the starter. That's why he looks so good in action that he just had over the weekend in Madison, and why I do believe that Penn State has all the confidence in the world that he'll be able to command the stage again, getting the start. Now, stylistically, what he does from a talent perspective, yes, he's a different quarterback than Drew Aller, more mobility that he brings to Penn State's offense. But as far as just how that can impact the way that they can attack Ohio State's defense, you can make the case that there are some positives to the enhanced mobility that Bo Prabula will provide, because there's all kinds of eye candy in Penn State's offense. So will the Nittany Lions take the field just as confident as they would have if Drew Aller is capable of starting? Yes, I think they're going to be confident in either guy. And it's also a bit of a banged up, Buckeyes outfit that comes in and prepares for this game as well. But Bo Prabula will be ready to take this stage.
And I remember in August, there was never a moment where James Franklin went out of his way to say Drew Aller is our number 1 guy, no doubt. Like, he kept talking all summer long about how much he liked Bo Prabula and how much the two of them were giving it a good run. What about big picture Penn State? I know the answer to this question is going to say, well, we'll find out Saturday. But how good are the Nittany Lions, right? You look at their wins this year. The West Virginia game felt really good, but now the Mountaineers are 4-4. They got a win against Illinois, a 6-2 team. Beat Wisconsin this past week fairly soundly. That's a 5-3 team. Nobody has a crazy good resume when you're only 7 or 8 games in, but from what you've seen so far, how good are they?
I've been abundantly impressed with Penn State this season. Some of the questions that we had coming into this year were about whether or not the offense could take that additional step in its combustibility and the explosion. We've seen that both with the passing attack and with the run game for the Nittany Lions. Now, not on a consistent basis, but to me, that's a good thing, because they've had to showcase versatility with their offense. It's not only about the big play with Drew Aller's big arm. It's not only about the open field ability of the running back position with Nicholas Singleton and Kaytron Allen. It can be about both. And we have seen them both blow teams away, even in contests where they've had slow starts. We have also seen them have to have games in the fourth quarter where they've had to rise up and make big plays. So they've been able to get to this undefeated point in the season, winning in about every which way you could hope to win. I would say really the main concern of any I would have for Penn State is the slow starts, because you'd like to come out of the gates more quickly. And on both sides of the football, we've seen them have to sort of sift through things, figure things out, and then play their best football in the second half. But if there's either half You're going to play at your best. You want it to be in half number 2. You want that finishing kick to be what's showcased. And that's really a big credit to James Franklin with new coordinators in all phases: offense, defense, special teams, a few players in and out of the lineup, both on defense and now possibly at quarterback. We've seen him continue to have Penn State playing their best football in the second halves of games. That's a really big deal when you're a team that's got championship aspirations.
Yeah, and in this rivalry specifically, slow starts have definitely hurt Penn State since James Franklin has been the head coach. I'm curious if you still feel – I feel like there's a little bit of a narrative that Penn State almost has to win this game for their playoff hopes. I don't buy that. I mean, I feel like if they're a one-loss team in the Big Ten and their only loss is to Ohio State, I don't mean to undermine the value of this game. I think this is a huge game. But especially if they look pretty good in this one, I don't think in a 12-team playoff world – they're eliminated. Do you?
I would agree. I would very much agree with that because their resume, certainly this game will enhance their resume. Frankly, win or lose, as long as they go out there and play well, this could be a resume enhancer. But in the expanded playoff era, with them already being in the top 5 in the country, this is a game that folks will come out of this, I think, feeling very impressed with what Penn State brings to the table. So win or lose, it can be a game that just bolsters the way folks perceive the Nittany Lions because Ohio State is one of the top teams in the country. And between the two of them, the perception will be coming in that Ohio State is the squad with more desperation because even though it was the number 1 team in the country, the Buckeyes do have a loss on their resume. Penn State does not. And each team comes in a bit wounded, but Penn State, if they're able to make this happen without their starting quarterback, if Drew Aller can't go in the game, if you don't have your QB, if you potentially don't have your best defensive player as well, if Deni Dennis Sutton can't go, then there's going to be a lot on the line for both these squads, but each can make the case that we're not at our peak. Physically, we're both a little bit banged up. And if Penn State can win this, man, you can make the case, you can make the argument that this is a squad that has the argument for number 2 in the country, perhaps behind the Oregon Ducks.
Yeah. Well, and I think also the flip side of this, there's sort of talk if Ohio State loses this, they're on the outside looking in. But again, they already have literally the best loss you could possibly have among any of these teams that will be fighting for an at-large berth, a 1-point loss on the road to the number 1 team in the country. They'd be on the road against another top 4 team if they lost this. Now, of course, 2 losses is going to be harder. But in this world of 12 teams, if they were to run the table from there on out, it'd be hard to think they wouldn't be right in the thick of a playoff discussion.
And it's supposed to be about not only the win-loss record, your full body of work, and the eye test, and some of those different factors will end up favoring Ohio State versus some of the other teams that are being discussed here. Of course, the Southeastern Conference is the other conference that's going to have a wide variety of teams who will be in consideration come playoff time. But if Ohio State is a 2-loss squad by the end of the regular season, if they don't end up making the Big Ten championship with that in mind, they will still have an immense resume in getting to that point. And they still have exceptional teams remaining on their schedule. I mean, think about if they happen to lose this weekend, but then if they were to go on to beat Indiana. A 2-loss Ohio State team that has a win over an Indiana Hoosier squad that could be in the top 10 in the country by the time that game were to take place, there will still be impressive wins that the Buckeyes have. And then in the end of it, the eye test will certainly favor Ohio State. I mean, even if they're not just dominating, wiping the floor with other teams, there are teams that remain on the Buckeye schedule that you will leave that game saying that they beat a quality opponent, and then you look at their roster top to bottom, the way that Will Howard is executing at quarterback, the way that right now they're a little bit banged up on the offensive line, but the versatility that they showcase where they can attack you with the deep ball, they still can. They've struggled a bit. The run game has certainly taken a step back over the last 2 games here, but if they can get that, crank back up, and then certainly that Buckeyes defense, if that defensive front starts to play to the caliber that we expect those guys in Columbus to play at, and they were able to control Tyree Walker, Penn State was able to control Tyree Walker with their run game over the weekend, and Ohio State has shown that they are also one of the top run defenses in America. So I think this is a squad that top to bottom shows they've got playmakers at every phase that can get this thing done. There are things worthy of concern, though, with the offensive line. Having no Josh Simmons, having him out for the season at left tackle, that's a very big deal.
Well, that's exactly where I was going next. The offensive line feels like the area that Buckeye fans are most concerned about. Simmons is gone. Guy who replaced him got injured this past week as well. How much of a concern is specifically the O-line right now?
I think that's where you benefit from having both Ryan Day and Chip Kelly in the meeting room because, the rest of the offensive line, there's some continuity that's been there. And, like Donovan Jackson was injured early in the season, came back into the lineup. He's starting to play well. That matchup on the interior between Donovan Jackson and Zane Bryant on the interior of Penn State's defense, that's one that's really worth looking forward to, because where they can win on the interior with that run game, you have Chip Kelly able to scheme things up. And when you have that, he's a guy that is willing now, more formidable from a physicality perspective with the way they run the football downhill, but then can also scheme things up into the open space, can attack you vertically and horizontally with the run. That sets up the potential for the explosive pass. And it really feels like over the last couple of weeks that Ohio State has wanted to lean more on the run game, even though Will Howard has been throwing the football with efficiency. If they feel that they can utilize that run game to set him up for some quality pass protection and utilize play action opportunities, then there's no reason to think Ohio State won't continue to be a really explosive threat on offense. And we know the talent they have both at wide receiver and at running back. So between Ryan Day and Chip Kelly, they will be able to scheme this offense up into advantageous situations.
I do say I get why a Buckeye fan is sweating things right now. The 2 games ago they lose. The last game they played was this weekend against Nebraska. If you have as much talent as they have, they don't expect to win by 4 points against Nebraska. Big picture overall, where's Ohio State right now?
They're a team that needs to continue getting better. I think by comparison to a team like Oregon that maybe started a bit slow earlier in the season, we've seen the Ducks begin to hit another gear. You can certainly make the same case, I think, about Indiana. As the Hoosiers competition throughout this season has continued to ramp up, we've seen the Hoosiers begin to play better and better football. Ohio State needs to find that additional gear. They started off playing well. As the opposition has continued to enhance, we haven't necessarily seen Ohio State hit that next gear as of yet. And I think it's there. I'm confident that it's plausible for the Buckeyes to go in that direction, but they've got to find it. Interesting comments from Will Howard this week, after their game the other day where they came out with the victory, talked about how Penn State didn't recruit him and how that's a little bit of an additional driver for him going into the game this week. Whatever it ends up being, where Ohio State finds that additional intangible edge for this game, where they feel a bit discounted, which they're starting to hear that, not only locally, but nationally, folks showing concern about the Buckeyes. If that becomes fuel for Ohio State, then that could be a dangerous thing for a team who does feel like they've been backed into a corner. When you've got that type of talent that Ohio State brings to the table, then yes, I do see that being the type of thing that can allow the Buckeyes to find that other gear.
There have been some awesome games between these two programs.
Yeah.
I mean, just since James Franklin's been here, there's been a 2 overtime game. There were back-to-back years, a 1-point game with massive fourth quarter comebacks. They're both ranked in the top 5. I mean, this is the highest rank for both teams since Franklin's gotten there, by the way, number 3 and number 4.
And stylistically, they're both teams that I think bring versatility with the way that they like to play physical football, but also have athletes they can put in space. So that to me is why, out of any of the top teams in the country that Penn State has really played well against at times, I think why it's been Ohio State, where they've just been narrow margins, they consistently come up short. It's because stylistically, they like to attack things in very similar ways.
Again, such a fun game. It's great every year. This year is going to live up to the hype once more. That's going to be over on Fox, but there are plenty of games to get to. Can Indiana make it 9-0 for the first time ever? Anthony's going to explain exactly what kind of challenge the Spartans will provide the Hoosiers after this. After Gatorade game leaders, we focus on D'Angelo Pons, your Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week. 2 picks, one of them returned for a score, 5 tackles on the day as Indiana improved to 8-0 over the weekend, and they are getting ready to make it 9-0, which if they do it, it'll be the first time in the history of Indiana football that they are 9-0 to start a season. They got Michigan State coming up this weekend. That's what's preventing them from being 9-0. How big a challenge will the Spartans provide?
I think they're going to be a really formidable challenge. When you look at the way Michigan State's begun playing here in recent weeks, Aiden Childs, yes, he's still kind of been good for like 1 turnover per game. It'll either be 1 interception or 1 fumble lost. But he is protecting the football at a higher level here in recent games than where he was earlier in the season. And so that Hoosiers defense has been so exceptional and has been in attack mode. Then they're not necessarily going to be able to create extra possessions for their offense in the way that we've seen Michigan State's offense start to, kind of figure things out in that regard. And what I think has accentuated Aiden Childs' ability to protect the football is the fact that their run game has gotten going. We've seen Kayron Lynch-Adams. We've seen what they've been able to do with the run game and Nate Carter, starting to use the physicality up front on an offensive line that, before now had some experience coming into this season. But it is the first season with Jonathan Smith and Brian Lindgren in that offense. But those two guys as play callers and Smith as a head coach / offensive mind, they've always been really effective with their zone blocking scheme. And I really thought it would be the inverse of what we saw this year from Michigan State. I thought the Spartans would begin to run the ball well early and kind of figure the passing attack out. It's sort of been the inverse of that, where they were really explosive in the passing game and have now begun to figure out the run game. So it's a big challenge, I think, for the Hoosiers defense. But we see week after week, they are up to that task. They are up for that challenge. You talked about D'Angelo Pons. The first series of the game with a pick six, you got your backup quarterback going into the game in Taven Jackson. How much more comfortable can it get before you've even played an offensive series? You take the field with a lead. That is a huge deal for the confidence and the comfort you can allow your backup to take the field with. And it's a Hoosiers defense that their front seven was getting the majority of the shine here in recent weeks, and now we see the way their secondary can make plays as well. So it's going to be a night that I think, for both teams is going to be a big deal to go into this game and sort of play within themselves. But it's one of those things that I think helps Curt Cignetti sleep really well at night, because he knows it doesn't have to all be on that Hoosiers offense. He's got one of the best defenses in America.
Well, you mentioned Aiden Childs, who had trouble losing the ball early on in the season, 9 picks. But in the last 3 games, he's only lost 1 interception. So he's done a nice job turning the corner. Speaking of quarterback play, it was kind of the big picture hurdle last week for Indiana. They don't have Curtis Rourke, their star quarterback, the guy who's leading the offense. They bring in Taven Jackson. It was pretty good. Now, granted, they barely passed the ball at all in the second half, so there wasn't a ton of pressure on him, but still, they survived without him. How big a difference is it whoever plays the most snaps this week in your mind?
Well, I think, this is the game that I think best case scenario folks are hopeful that Curtis Rourke would be able to return for. But when you factor in the way they're able to run the football, and it's a combination of things. They're really talented in the backfield, and beyond even the talents. Justice Ellison, I've gotten to talk to him a couple of different times during the season here. He is such a phenomenally impressive young man. Just that leadership, and all the guys they brought in the transfer portal seem fully invested, fully engaged in just being Indiana Hoosiers, what they're doing for this fan base, the joy they're bringing to Bloomington and now the college football world, really being fully behind Indiana as well. So they run the ball really well. Ellison had almost 30 carries in that contest, but he's accustomed to that. He's handled the power conference stage a bit before. And their offensive line, they're not necessarily the deepest group up front, but they're playing at an exponential rate. They can protect the quarterback at a high level. They run block at a really high level also. And, the scheme that they throw at folks is not necessarily like they have a bunch of different things they have to be aware of as the O-line. A lot of their run and pass schemes look very similar within that RPO system, but they're led by their center on the interior, Mike Kadick, and he makes sure that they diagnose what's happening pre-snap, whether it's the box count, the defensive front, if they're facing someone who throws a bunch of stem and movement at them, like they'll face this week against that Michigan State defense, they'll be ready for it. And they've been performing at a really high level there, not only as pass protectors, but as run blockers. And so even if we don't see Curtis Rourke again, we know they've got a unit up front. We know they've got playmakers outside at receiver. We know they've got running backs who will help in pass protection and are very versatile out of the backfield as pass receivers and physical runners. So the totality of what Indiana does on offense, both schematically and from a personnel perspective, they really insulate whatever concern there might be about Taven Jackson, who does know this offensive system because he's gotten a little bit of time, but he's been around this program for years, even predating Curt Cignetti arriving this season.
They continue to be the #1 story in the country.
Right.
Now, the #1 team in the country is Oregon once again. They're playing a Michigan Wolverine squad that has had quarterback troubles all season long. And then late last night, we found out some news involving the Wolverines. Jack Tuttle announced he will retire from college football. He's a 25-year-old kid who suffered his 5th concussion earlier this year. He decided it is best for his health for him to be done playing for the Michigan Wolverines. I will say, big picture, I think it's great that athletes are doing this when it has to be in that situation. It's obviously awful that they've had injuries and they have to retire. But the fact that it's understood and accepted that an athlete can do the smart thing for their mental and physical health to step away. In a less important way, what does this do to the Michigan quarterback situation, which has been up and down almost every single week this year?
Well, the fortunate thing, and I sort of assumed going into the bye week that we would see back-to-back starts for Jack Tuttle, because in the years he's been in college football, and that was one of the things that, was remarkable about reading his post on social media, just talking about the things he's been through with concussions and shoulder injuries and the like. And, I knew he'd been banged up. I was calling his games for the Pac-12 Network even way back when he was playing quarterback at Utah, backing up Tyler Huntley way back then, and he was viewed as being the future of the Utes program. Then we saw him as a backup to Michael Penix with the Indiana Hoosiers. And so now at this point, where for Michigan, he's been in and out of the lineup throughout this season and hasn't necessarily been able to sustain health in Ann Arbor. At least he is a national champion, like so many other guys in that lineup are. But for this season, Davis Warren now returning to the lineup, and that combination between Davis Warren and Alex Orji, we saw the best combined skills for them as they took the field and were able to play well against Michigan State the other night. Davis Warren protected the football at a high level, delivered it with decisiveness and accuracy. And in the end, we saw a version of Alex Orji that ran with decisiveness and urgency, speed and power. And a lot of us were very hopeful that that combination would lead to very positive things and pay dividends for Michigan even earlier in the season. They weren't protecting the football at a high level and trying to figure out which one guy in a singular sense could maybe move the offense. Now we're seeing that the combined skills of Warren and Orji really seem to be in a position to pay dividends for Michigan at quarterback that we didn't see earlier in the year. And that should enhance the production of an offensive line that for years now has been amongst the best in America.
Good, yeah.
When you've got playmakers at QB, then that should be able to enhance the way that it frees up things for the running back position, because now the defense can't just sort of pin their ears back on what they do in attacking that backfield. So I do love the way that now their offense has more versatility to it than it did previously.
So you're hopeful that their passing numbers can get better, which right now are not good. I mean, they have the fifth worst passing offense in the country right now. The polar opposite is happening at Oregon. I mean, Dylan Gabriel has got to be at the front. Maybe not number one if you want to argue Ashton Genty, or maybe somebody else, Cam Ward, but he is in the thick of that Heisman discussion.
Yeah, I can't imagine why he wouldn't be. And yes, I mean, he's on the tip of everyone's tongue, in talking about the Heisman conversation. And for Gabriel, it's that combination of precision and power that he throws the football with. And now we see him utilizing his legs in a really big way also. So as a defender, what do you do to really try to make him uncomfortable as a quarterback? Because his brain is like a microprocessor. He reads what the defense is going to do pre-snap. He knows he's got weaponry on the outside that he can try to fit the football into, even if they haven't separated from defenders. He trusts his accuracy, which at times has led to some interceptions, but he trusts himself to put the football exactly where he wants to put it at a moment where his playmaker has the best opportunity to get it, even when there are some tight windows there on occasion. He's playing the quarterback position at a level even beyond what many of us anticipated would be the case. And then he's got this offensive line that is mammoth and is playing really well, and running backs that will brutalize and batter you also, and a defense that's now shutting opponents down. So this is the totality of what a lot of us thought Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks were going to be capable of.
Right. He's got a lot of talent around him, but he's leading that group of talented guys.
No doubt.
76% completion percentage right now for Dylan Gabriel. Well, and this is part of our new reality of having the 12-team playoff, is the discussions, the disagreements, the arguments are shaped a little differently. It's no longer 4 versus 5, where is the tragedy. It will be 12 versus 13.
Yeah.
And as you're watching Jerry and Urban come at this from a coach's point of view, you came at it from a very different point of view, and I think I'm on your side too.
I did, because Boise State nearly beat the number one team in the country in their non-conference schedule. They happen to play in the Mountain West, so they have a certain allotment of conference games they have to play. And if you want to tell me that, they should schedule every one of their non-conference games against a highly ranked power conference team, I'm guessing from the history of Boise State football, they might be willing to do that because they've been amazing over the years. They nearly made the BCS playoff a few different times when Kellen Moore was their quarterback. I was calling those games back then. But in the end, there's two that it is needed to tango in that regard. So to have at least some sort of automatic qualification for 5 different conferences, to me, makes all the sense in the world, because if you're a group of 5 team or a non-power conference team, you know that if you're highly ranked, you're going to have the opportunity there. And they have to win and play in the conference that is designated to them. Right now, Boise State being in the Mountain West, if they win that, they should be able to make the college football playoff. And so if you just take the top 12 teams in the country based off the college football playoff rankings, that's extremely subjective in its own right. So at least to have something that's a very defined way to make the playoff makes a bunch of sense to me. If you just say the top 12 teams, so is it just going to be the Big Ten SEC Invitational then? Because the perception of these two leagues is that they're going to be the 12 best teams in the country.
Yeah, I agree. And also, again, for what it's worth, I am shedding no tears for the number 12 team. If it's a Big Ten team, still, okay.
Yeah.
That is what it is. We're expanding enough. I'm not going to feel that bad for
And I know you cover hoops and call hoops, very closely and everything like that. I mean, the 68-team field, the first four out. I don't lose a lot of sleep over that. I'd have been fine if it was still the two-team BCS myself. But they've expanded this team. I like the fact that there is a defined way that you make it to some extent. It's going to be subjective. We've talked about it, whether it's Indiana or other squads, whether it's a one-loss team, a two-loss team, maybe even a three-loss team at a certain point here. There's going to be some subjectivity that goes into it for the teams who don't win their individual conference. But if you're one of those squads on the outside looking in, there's still going to be an opportunity to make the postseason. But I don't think it should just be, sort of confined to the teams who are in the league or the teams who are perceived as the top 12, because it is very subjective. You and I can look at the same exact film. Me and those two great coaches can look at the same exact film and feel a little bit different about which team is better, which team isn't. So the subjectivity should only be part of it. I like the fact that they've defined, though, that conference champions end up making it.
I agree. And this is the first of what will be many, many playoff discussions over the coming 6 or 7 weeks.
1 week from today, right?
Comes to close. That's right. The rankings do start to officially come out soon. Here's a look at the big board. You got 8 games involving Big Ten teams this weekend on the Big Ten Network. Just look at that top line. We got a game at noon Eastern, 11 Central. We got a game at 3:30 Eastern, 2:30 Central. And we got a primetime game as well with USC and Washington. That's at 7:30 Eastern, 6:30 Central time. On the bottom left, you see Minnesota taking on Illinois. That happens on FS1, noon Eastern, 11 Central time. That's an interesting matchup. This is a Gophers team that has been kind of sneaky, right? They've had a really good defense, even though they don't get talked about among the great defenses. Certainly in their past defense, they've won 3 consecutive games going up against an Illinois team that's been in the national spotlight for the last month or so. I like this matchup.
I agree. And the way that Minnesota is starting to play, and getting to talk to PJ Fleck on Big Ten Radio this week, he always exudes a certain level of control and confidence. But you can see he's really pleased with the way his team is playing. And it's a bit different than we're accustomed to seeing the Golden Gophers play on offense, because the way they're operating, they're leading with the passing attack. And PJ Fleck was telling me just yesterday, he kind of expected that coming into the season, even as talented as Darius Taylor is as a running back, but having an offensive line that was going to have some new moving pieces, the talent that he can access at wide receiver, and now a quarterback in Max Brosmer that continues to grow throughout the season. He's gone beyond just being efficient to now getting to the point of being explosive. He is coming off a career high effort that he's had as a signal caller, and multiple receivers with multiple touchdown catches in that game as well. You understand why that composure, that confidence is being exuded by PJ Fleck. And I think for the Gophers defense, I agree with you. They're really underregarded for what they've done this season. Early in the year, they were shutting down some passing attacks that didn't throw the football very effectively. As they've gone forward here, though, now we are seeing them facing high-level quarterback play, high-level schematics on offense, and they're still making life really difficult on their opponents to both throw the football and to just drop back and pass it. So this is a really good matchup, especially considering the Illini now coming off their second defeat of the season. How do they respond? What kind of bounce back do they show?
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go. We talk so much about the great scenes in Bloomington recently. Champagne's had some awesome crowds. They're creating a really great home field advantage, multiple sellouts this year for the first time in more than a decade. But they're coming off a real bad beatdown. I mean, it was clear from the get-go Oregon was the much better team in that game. How concerned are you about them losing whatever momentum and positive energy they had before this past weekend's game?
It's a big task for Brett Bielema, I think, because it's one thing to try and recover when you feel like, we played really well and we just couldn't quite get it done. It's another when you just sort of get overmatched by the opponent. And that's kind of what it looked like against the number one team in the country. So it's not the most shocking result. But within that locker room, Illinois is at a point now where they take the field against every team every week and expect to win that game, expect to compete and play at a really high level. Luke Altmaier had been protecting the football really well throughout most of the season. He has multiple turnovers in that game against the Oregon Ducks. So to be able to lock in and kind of get back to the precision that we saw Illinois operating with, I think will be a big part of that task. And to make sure for the Illini defense, Aaron Henry, trying to figure out how does he go about making Max Brosmer uncomfortable in this game. He's certainly got multiple guys that can rush the quarterbacks. That makes a big difference when each outside linebacker essentially can beat guys one-on-one. So that's going to be a very big deal for the Gophers in their pass protection to make sure Gabe Akers isn't going to be able to wreck the game against them. But what they do, I think, especially on pass coverage on the back end, can they take the ball away? Can they try to sort of shrink and diminish the Gophers' playbook? Because we've seen Greg Harbaugh get more and more schematically diverse with how they're going about passing the football, trusting the timing and precision of a lot of outcuts and outbreaking routes within the Gophers' passing attack that were really impressive to watch them execute in their last game. So can the Illini take that away from an alignment and an assignment perspective with their pattern match and see whether or not Brosmer can consistently throw the ball up the rails, where now maybe you're going to have more hands and more deflected passes to possibly put the ball in harm's way?
Let's turn our attention to another classic Big Ten rivalry, Wisconsin taking on Iowa. This Hawkeye defense has been as good as it usually is. Special teams too. Offense, a lot of the numbers are much better than last year's offense. But the quarterback play just hasn't been what they've hoped it would be once Cade McNamara came over from Michigan. Brendan Sullivan replaced him in the last game. How did things feel different once he was in there?
It was an intriguing spot to be in, calling that game at Kinnick Stadium over the weekend here on the Big Ten Network, because Cade McNamara started off the game with a high-quality first series, led to a field goal initially, and then had a couple of series in a row where they struggled. Now, we did know going in that Iowa was going to rotate quarterbacks. They had actually shared that with us a bit. And Brendan Sullivan was set to come in, but Cade McNamara got banged up. And when he came out of the locker room in the second half, didn't have his helmet in his hand anymore, was still there rooting his teammates on, was still there dapping up and enjoying Brendan Sullivan. This type of fire that Brendan Sullivan plays with, where after completing a pass, he outraces his tight end to pick up blocks in the open field. That type of competitive fire that Sullivan has shown throughout the season has really infused some extra juice in the Iowa's offense throughout the year. Now, as the full-time starter, because Cade McNamara not even on the depth chart this week for the Hawkeyes. So Brendan Sullivan will get his first start for the Hawks this weekend. What does that look like against a Wisconsin defense that has really started to play well and that has found an enhanced pass rush over where they were earlier in the season? It makes life really difficult on the opposing QB. It's got to be about Caleb Johnson. It's got to be about the offensive line for Iowa, just to make sure that they're not going to have to put the full load of the offense on the throwing acumen of Brendan Sullivan, but utilize his mobility. It may be a slightly different Iowa offense this weekend, utilizing the QB run game, moving the pocket in an enhanced way with Sullivan at QB versus what they were doing with Cade McNamara.
They'll do it against a Badger team that I know lost this past weekend to Penn State, but generally speaking, the last month, it's felt like the Wisconsin of old. It's felt like watching a Wisconsin team that you thought Luke Fickell could be in charge of.
And the run game, the success they've had in that phase has been a big part of why, while it still does have kind of the Phil Longo wrinkle to it, because the way that Braden Locke has stepped in at quarterback, they will mix in some tempo. They will mix in a bit of no huddle and hurry up and accentuate that just because it suits the current quarterback, Braden Locke, in a way that maybe Tyler Van Dyke wasn't as comfortable with early in the season. And now that they've been able to find out, last weekend notwithstanding against Penn State, one of the top run defenses in the country, but Wisconsin has found a way with Tyree Walker to more consistently run the football, and especially when he gets into the open field, he's been a home run hitter at running back for the Badgers. So that'll be probably the crux of this contest. Will the mixed-in tempo accentuate Wisconsin's run game, or will the QB mobility for the Hawkeyes accentuate what Caleb Johnson, one of the top running backs in the country, can do against that Wisconsin Badgers front seven? Which team can scheme their high-level running game into some explosiveness, into some points? That's really what's going to tell the tale. So it's interesting that Wisconsin, Iowa, the run game is normally the main storyline going in, but there are wrinkles with how these teams are going about kind of scheming up the run that's a little bit different than what we've historically seen.
By the way, before we go, I have the stat of the weekend in the Big Ten.
Should I write it down?
Iowa's record in the month of November, the last 19 games. Take a guess.
Last 19 games. 16-3.
18-1. Wow. They have won 18 of their last 19 games in the month of November.
You weren't lying. That's a good one.
Thank you. Well, you don't know if I was lying because you don't have the truth, but I was telling you the truth. That is their actual record, 18-1. Anthony's going to give us his list of the top 5 teams in the Big Ten right now when we come back. Where does he have undefeated Indiana? Where does he have one-loss Ohio State? Who is that 5th team? Find out next. Saturday, a football tripleheader right here in the Big Ten Network kicks off with Northwestern taking on Purdue, then Nebraska hosting UCLA, followed by USC against Washington. It all starts with Big Ten Tailgate. We will be in Lincoln for that afternoon game. Saturday, right here on the Big Ten Network. Anthony, it is time for your Impact 5. Very simple this week. Your 5 best teams in the Big Ten right now. I think most people could gather the top 4. We talked about all 4 of them being in the playoff. Maybe the order could be different. But I think there's a lot of question on number 5. Who's your 5th team in the Big Ten right now?
To me, this was a difficult position to determine with certainty. I feel really good about it, though, and I expect a quality response from the Illini because this week, Illinois is coming off an effort last weekend that didn't suit what we had seen from Brett Bielema and his squad throughout the season. But it's just one game. And they're a team that, when I talk about squads that have been ascending throughout the year, Illinois began looking over the past month like a team that was far beyond what we saw earlier in the season in that initial month, even in some of the quality wins over ranked opponents that they had earlier in the year. They've begun to, not only on offense, but on defense as well, really give people fits. And so, yes, that performance from last week against the number 1 team in the country is not what the standard is that the Illini want to set for this season. But I do think they are still one of the top 5 teams in the Big Ten. I've got them squarely at number 5. Well, there were a couple of other squads that I kind of considered for a moment.
This is an Illinois team. I mentioned the home field advantage they've been getting with the sellouts they've had now. If they win this game, they'll be 6-0 at home. First time the Orange and Blue have done that since the year 2001. Your number 4 team in the Big Ten right now is?
This one is a bit surprising, not only for me, but I think for a lot of folks out there. I've got the Ohio State University Buckeyes as the number 4 team in my Impact 5. And it's not just about the talent of the roster. It's not just about some of the skills that they bring to the table, because certainly, as we've talked about in the preseason and early in the year, they may be the most talented roster in America. They're not performing quite to that standard, though. And how do they figure out, with a banged-up offensive line, how do they figure out how to run the ball, how to at least get Henderson and Judkins more consistently involved in things? That receiver position, with Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka, how do they make sure Carnell Tate finding the combustibility that's available to them within that passing attack to be a consistent part of the way that they operate? And certainly the defense with talent at all different levels. Can they completely just dominate against quality teams? We haven't necessarily seen the pure dominance that we thought was going to be available to Ohio State on the defensive side of the football. It's there, but there's a reason that I have them at number 4 right now.
My favorite part about watching them this year, outside of some spectacular explosive plays, is when they get in the red zone, they score.
Yeah.
Literally every time. 27 trips, 27 scores, 25 of them have been touchdowns. Your number 3 team in the league is?
Well, we're going to get a really good matchup this weekend because they are not only at number 3 in the Big Ten, number 3 in the country are the Penn State Nittany Lions. And I think that what we've seen, not only with their starting quarterback, but as we were talking about, Bo Pribula as the number 2 QB coming in, we've seen the way that he can move with his legs. We've seen some precision with his arm as well. And in recognizing the entire offensive system that's available to him, there will be a big opportunity, a huge proving ground available to the Nittany Lions this week. The secondary has begun making more plays as of late also. So you can kind of combine all the elements available to them, and especially with Tyler Warren, what he can do as a tight end, as a quarterback, as a running back, as a snapper, you name it. We've seen him get that done as well. And that creativity of the Andy Kotelnicki system, I think it's a really good combination. One of the purest and most versatile combinations we've seen in James Franklin's time in State College, with what they can do in all phases and with new coordinators all over the place for Franklin to work with and to kind of, urge along here. I think we're seeing one of the best coaching performances that James Franklin has had in his time leading Penn State.
A win would be so big for him personally. There'd be the first win that he's had against Ohio State since 2016, which, of course, was the last time they won the Big Ten championship. So does that mean your number 2 team in the league resides in Bloomington right now?
Yes, it does. There's not a team in the Big Ten, few teams in the country that have been as consistently excellent, as dominant as the Indiana Hoosiers. And it's not just about the offense. Yes, it's really impressive that Taylor Jackson came in and was able to be very efficient with his arm and make plays with his legs. We've seen the offensive line and the run game do big things. We know Elijah Surratt and all those wide receivers have been playmakers. But yes, folks starting to gain more and more appreciation for what that Bryant Haynes Indiana defense is. Within the front seven, how they rush the quarterback with Mikal Kamara. On the back end, D'Angelo Pons, the reigning Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week. What they do, not only getting takeaways, but putting the football into the end zone. This is an all-around exceptional football team. They're not quite ranked in the top 10 in the country as of yet, but there are several teams ranked above them in the AP poll that I'm wondering, why is that the case? Because no one has been able to control games in the way that Indiana has. And even as the competition they faced has gotten better, the Hoosiers, especially in the fourth quarter, in crunch time, when it matters most, they have been tested by teams, but man, that fourth quarter has been exceptional.
Yeah, if they were wearing Auburn's uniforms or Michigan's uniforms, they would be in the top 10 for sure.
Yeah.
That means your number one team is the Ducks.
This was probably the most obvious one. I mean, it's the number one team in the country, the number one team in my Impact 5. And we talked about Dylan Gabriel a bit earlier in the show. And I think there's more force to the way that Oregon is playing at this point. They showcased it against Ohio State, the physicality that they can access on both lines of scrimmage. And then you also add in the way that their run game is now more downhill. It's not only about space and pace and fluidity and finesse. This is an Oregon squad that can stand up in the octagon and say, let's get it on. They will bring the brass knuckles whenever they need it. And so this is a team that was already excellent early. And I told you, they were furthest away from their ceiling.
Right.
We are starting to see them approach it at this point.
How scary is that?
Right.
This team is loaded. They have great talent every year. Signing day this year, they had the number one class in the Big Ten, ahead of Ohio State.
Incredible.
They're deep, they are talented. They're the number one team in the country for a reason. Thanks for watching.